Okay, are we ready? Are we live?
Yes.
Thank you. Very well. Well, as mentioned, the next session is going to be on the topic of fraud, and Lynn has presented to us before. And I think we have a very important role, though, because this is a standard that's in the process of being revised, and this is our opportunity to provide important feedback on that. And with that, Lynn, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Jim, and good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everybody on the CAG. I've presented to you about fraud before, but today I'm going to give you an update on what happened at the March meeting, since the March meeting, and what we discussed in June. So since March, we have done two major things in terms of the project. Firstly, we've conducted outreach to users of financial statements on the reporting of fraud, which we did in June and July. And thank you to the CAG members who participated in that. And secondly, we have had further discussions with the board on selected topics, which was at the June meeting. Next slide, please. And those selected topics are now on the screen. The introduction we'll come back to later. In terms of specialised skills, we've talked about determining the need for specialised skills, including forensic skills, and describing what forensic skills are in the context of an audit. On 315, we initially did a lot of work taking the requirements of 315 and putting them into 240. The feedback we got from the board was make it incremental and only put in what's fraud specific. So we have actually redone 315 through that fraud lens. On the presumption of risk in revenue recognition, we've shifted the auditor's focus to robust risk and identification and assessment from developing a rebuttal. And we've provided more guidance on the circumstances or conditions relating to revenues that could arise with fraud risks. Journal entries is obviously an important element of fraud auditing, and we've tied that more closely to 315 and also concentrated on completeness. In terms of communication with those charged with governance, we've emphasised two-way communication, and also that communication should be ongoing. Obviously, I'll come back and talk more on transparency in the auditor's report in a minute. And I note that in May, the non-authoritative guidance, which identifies the relationship between 240 and other ISAs, was published. Next slide, please. Okay, given the mixed views that we have received on transparency and the fact we only had one user, a better and important user, talk about it and from the discussion paper, we decided we would talk to users of financial statements. So we have talked to 24 users of financial statements, and we put in front of the board these four options at the March meeting to see whether they agreed with them, which they did. The first option being describing the fraud risks. The second one builds on that, adding what the auditor did. The third one adds further to 1 and 2 by including the auditor's findings and observations. Option 4 is status quo. One should always have a status quo, so that's including fraud as a CAM. And then subsequent to the March CAG meeting, we identified a 5th option, which was identifying significant deficiencies in internal control that are relevant to the prevention and detection of fraud. Next slide, please. Of the 24 users that I said we talked to, they came from different locations, different backgrounds, and we provided them with a short paper describing the describing the 5 options. Every interview was an hour long, and we it was attended by 1 staff member and 1 task force member. And the chart shows the preferences of people, the pie chart. It doesn't add up to 24 because some people had more than 1 preference, and we certainly developed a thought. It reinforced our thinking that these aren't mutually exclusive during these interviews. That's all I wanted to say on that slide. So let's move to the next one. All of the people we spoke to gave us some really, really good input. And so we identified some key takeaways from that, just to not go through all of them, but to pick a few. Users of financial statements value more transparency about fraud and auditors' reports. Users recognise that the prevention and detection of fraud is a primary responsibility of management and those charged with governance. Generally, users wanted more specific information and not boilerplate statements. And another one was users of the financial statements recognise the importance of obtaining information relating to internal controls. And the rationale for this is that they want indicators of what could go wrong. And it was also recognition that it then included the behaviour of management as a part of that. Next slide, please. As a result of that, bringing together the users' responses and the discussion paper, we have developed a little framework, which is on the screen now, to think about how we should look at transparency in an auditor's report. Don't intend to go through it, it's in the paper. So we'll move on to the next slide. Okay, therefore the task force has put forward this as an option as our recommendation at this point in time to enhance transparency in the auditor's report on fraud by including a separate section that encompasses a description of the auditor's responsibilities relating to fraud in the auditor financial statements. It identifies the assessed risks and the auditor's response to those risks. And it identifies any significant, putting a lot of emphasis on significant, deficiencies in internal controls in terms of both prevention and detection of fraud in the financial statements. The task force believes that this is responsive to the calls of every stakeholder to be more transparent about fraud in the financial statements. And we obviously have more work to do to develop this forward. So we're putting it in front of people as a recommendation at this point in time, and we undoubtedly will get more robust feedback about it. Next slide, please. Jim, we're up to questions about that now, and then I'll come back and talk about the introductory paragraphs. So do you want to take the questions now, or do you want me to do introductory paragraphs and take all the questions at once? I'm comfortable either way.
Why don't we see if there's some questions now?
Okay.
And if not, then we'll continue on, but I'll open it up. Paul?
Yeah, just wondering, the option 5 you brought up, obviously that wasn't part of the voting or the polling. Would you see that in addition to one of the other options, or is it mutually exclusive? It seems like that would be required in addition to whatever other disclosures would be necessary.
Yeah, I guess, Paul, that was the biggest surprise for us, was how many of the users chose that option as being their preferred option. So it was a significant discussion with the users and a significant preference from them. We certainly see, and I think we have picked from all of the options and come up with a hybrid from them. We would see that you would need to have that plus the hybrid of the other options. You couldn't just do internal controls. The thing that was interesting from those discussions was, we said, you know, if management aren't providing information on internal controls, can the auditor actually provide information? And the reaction from users was absolutely. We don't want to hear from management about this. We want to hear from the auditors. So I think that's going to be a challenge for the profession going forward. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. Hilda.
Thank you. Good afternoon or good evening or good morning, Lynn. Thank you very much for the presentation. And what you just said about, you know, this will be a challenge for the profession. I think that's indeed the mixed views that we have heard on the proposals for more transparency that I understand are largely based on the input from users. I think on the first one, to be more explicit on the auditor's responsibilities, I think there is wide support for that within the profession. On the two others, we get mixed views. For instance, in the Netherlands, they tried to introduce this last year for listed entities, and the fact that the auditor is disclosing on matters that management is not required to disclose on has made it difficult to put that in practice. So they definitely need to do further work on this. And I think that is the issue where indeed there's going to be most discussion as to how this actually can be done, where there is agreement that management has the primary responsibility for the detection and the prevention of fraud, but apparently not for the reporting on it, where then the primary responsibility would shift to the auditor. So and within the profession and potentially more widely, there is some kind of a disconnect that is seen between those two. Specifically on the second point, for the auditor to disclose the or to speak about the identified and assessed fraud risks and the auditor's response to the assessed risks, there was a comment that why is this apparently for all risks and not for the significant ones, which is added to the last point on the deficiencies in internal control. So there seems to be potentially a imbalance between the two. So maybe that's something that you could consider as well. I think as far as the difficulty to do this, the last one, the one where the auditor would report on identified significant deficiencies in the internal controls that are relevant to the prevention and the detection of fraud in the financial statements, this one was clearly seen as the most difficult ones for auditors to report on if that's not something that management would do. And there are parallels between this project and the going concern one, where, in order to get to the aim of it, to have, more prevention and detection of fraud, it's a holistic responsibility where, management, those charged with governance, auditors and supervisors and potentially others all have a role. And so that's why we get some questions. What is the role of the others? How is that enhanced in comparison to the role of the auditors? I'm sure you will have further discussions on that in the board. Thank you.
Thank you. Jim, could I just respond to a couple of things there they were very useful comments. The first, certainly on the part of what we did in terms of the fraud risks, of the assessed risks. Inherent in that is that they are material or significant, but maybe if that isn't coming through strongly enough, we might need to be more explicit on that. And I'd just like to, the other two things, certainly I think there is an open question between management and auditors here, and that is probably the long-term matter that the profession is going to have to deal with. And I wholly endorse your comment that this has to be holistic. This has to be integrated. It has to be all brought together. And fraud shouldn't be seen entirely as a add-on or something different. What we're trying to achieve is an integrated picture of risk, including both fraud and error. So that's a really important point from my perspective. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you. Okay, moving on, we have Dawn.
Thanks, Jim. And thanks for your presentation, Lynn. It looks like a lot of work has occurred since we last looked at this topic. When the S&P provided their feedback, they provided support for option 4, but I appreciate there are these additional options right now. I echo Hildy's comments around the responsibilities between those charged with governance, management, and the auditors, and it does look when we are the ones providing the content on what the significant deficiencies are, that our role is being elevated. So all the comments and concerns about expectation gap and that kind of come to mind. A couple of questions, and I don't know if you have any feedback on this, but have we looked at whether or not there would have to be legislative changes in any of the jurisdictions? Like, would it be seen that we are having concerns or violating any confidentiality by putting the matters directly in the auditor report? And also, I had a concern and wondered if you had looked specifically at the not-for-profit community, because I'm concerned that putting the deficiencies and those kind of things right out there in the public space, if there would be any impact on either community support or their sources of funding.
Thank you, Dawn.
The answer to the first one is yes, we have considered legislation in different areas, and there could well be preclusions from people actually reporting this, and that would have to be taken into account. And we have particularly considered that in terms of the requirement to disclose findings or observations. And that's why we've made it voluntary rather than specific. At present, and one of the things I glossed over, because we certainly have mixed views on this, is whether this should apply to listed and or all entities. And this ED should be entitled mixed views, because this is certainly one where we have some saying it should only be for listed, some saying it should be for all entities, and we haven't called that one at this point in time. Oops, sorry, but that obviously upset my puppy. He obviously has a view. Yeah, so that one is an open question at this point in time.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you, Dawn. And Hussein?
Oh, thank you. My concern is about disclosure on fraud. As fraud is rare in financial reporting ecosystem, fraud is not common, but its impact is huge, both on financial market and perception of investor. Therefore, without disclosing approach or other issues about fraud, without actual fraud or without highly suspected potential fraud, I think most of the client, most of the company do not want to disclose the approach, or because reader of financial user of financial statement or audit reports, it creates suspect. Therefore, without actual finding on fraud, actual fraud or highly potential fraud, disclosing approach or other issues, auditor audit procedure or audit opinion about fraud issues, I think it's creates some problem with audit firm and between audit firm and audit client. Therefore, it should be very carefully considered. And when I look at the options, option 3 is for the user of finance statements more favorable, but without actual fraud cases, if there's no finding, no observation on fraud issues, it may be for auditor key audit matter. Therefore, option 5 also consider it. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Hussein. And Lynn, since I have several hands up, I'm just going to continue on here for a little bit.
Yep.
Hyson?
Yes, good evening. Thank you, Jim. Thank you for the presentation. Really, we understand that addressing the transparency in the auditor's report regarding to the fraud is really important, because will increase the quality and make the differentiation between the different clients. But of course, there is here some risk to be addressed on this. We understand there are mixed views on the scope of options that are presented, but our opinion is that to have some kind of differentiation between value, not only on the audit reporting for the big companies, but also for small and medium-sized ones. Thank you.
Thank you, Hyson. Kazuhiro.
Thank you for Jim, and thank you for good presentation. My personal opinion is in favor of option 4, but the IAASB must respect the fact that many users support option 3 from the perspective of the public interest. But I think there are some caveats to opinion in favor of option 3. First of all, there are concerns about the extent of fraud that users expect to be described in audit reports. Fraud covered by ISA 240 is fraud that risks leading to material misstatement of financial statements. However, there is a possibility that the scope of fraud requested by the users is not limited to that. They may also consider fraud that does not directly lead to material misstatement of financial statement, such as bribery, corruption, and money laundering. Therefore, in order to reduce the gap between users' expectations and ISA 240, the audit report should clearly state that the fraud described in accordance with ISA 240 is limited to fraud that could lead to material misstatement. Second, if option 3 is adopted, there is a concern that the purpose of the audit report will change. If frauds that are not important enough to be described in a connection with CAM and the accounting auditor's response to them are described separately from CAM in the audit report, there is concern that the purpose of the auditor's report will change from stating an opinion on whether the financial statements are properly prepared in accordance with the applicable financial reporting framework to reporting fraud. Opinion 3 also requires a description of auditor's findings and observations. However, I think it can be addressed by describing the findings and observations of auditor in relation to the CAM, as well as related to fraud findings and observations contained therein. If the findings and observations of the accounting auditor are not described regarding CAM, but if the findings and observations regarding fraud are described separately, I feel concerned that the purpose of the auditor's report will change from stating an opinion on whether financial statements are properly prepared to reporting fraud and the auditor's response. Considering the above, I think that careful consideration is necessary when adopting option 3. And option 5 has almost no merit in Japan. Our internal control report and its audit report are introduced separately from the audit report. A wider range of deficiencies are communicated to those charged with governance and in internal control reports. It has been pointed out that the introduction of option 5 and the requirement to include such information in the audit report may, on the contrary, reduce the scope of deficiencies communicated to those charged with governance. In addition, it is expected that the practice will be confused if the description in the audit report on financial statements and the description in the internal control report and this audit report are introduced together. Option 5 should be introduced only in jurisdictions where internal control reports have not been introduced. Thank you.
Thank you. Barb.
Thank you, and thank you to the team for the great presentation. Just a few considerations maybe for the group to take into account. If you think about pursuing options 1, 2, 3, and potentially even 4, I might encourage some outreach or some research on what are typically identified as fraud risk. While I think that the standards encourage auditors to identify very unique, specific fraud risks, I don't know that that's always the case. And so I think in a lot of cases, you will find the same fraud risks across companies that really wouldn't tell someone whether there was a heightened risk. You might see management override of controls, lack of segregation of duties, misappropriation of assets, that are there because they're things all teams think they should look at rather than being specific to the company under audit. I think with respect to option number 4, if you look at some of the early reporting of key audit matters, there were a few instances where firms did identify as a CAG misappropriation of assets. And when you look at the reports, it was difficult to ascertain why that was necessarily a CAG for that company, or if it might have just been a bit of an over-reporting and not really been specific. With respect to option 5, certainly give some thought to auditors that are not taking a control reliance approach and may only be looking at the design and implementation of controls. Now, you may have auditors who are testing fraud controls, but not testing internal controls over financial reporting. And I think you'll also have to give thought to, the reporting on fraud controls, but not internal controls over financial reporting, and whether that will give users a false sense of security that internal controls over errors and the accuracy of financial reporting is, that those have been tested and are fine. Thank you.
Thank you, Barb. Peter?
Thank you, and good evening from the OECD in Paris. Thank you, Lynn. And I'd like to focus on the remarks being said about the role of others. The ultimate responsibility for the management of risks of fraud is that of management. And so auditors, external and internal, should be considering and evaluating controls implemented by management to mitigate those risks. So I believe that the responsibilities of external audit should not be spelt out in isolation, but we should consider these in the context of the responsibilities of other actors. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And Lynn, I'll just add on from my perspective, because we did some work in this area in the governmental area. There's certain terms other than fraud, such as abuse, and we had trouble where people, the same issue with fraud, how do you conclude that it's fraud or not fraud, or so forth and so on. And where we landed after a lot of consultation and exposure period is really focusing on the deficiencies in the related internal controls that resulted in that elevated risk. And to the extent they were significant, they would be reported or material. So I think from my perspective, and given the feedback we had, not only from auditors, but from others, that seemed like it's been a better pathway to addressing both the issue and I think the expectation gap. And with that, I finally do not have any more hands up. So Lynn, I'll turn it back to you and let you go.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for all of those interesting observations and questions. If I could just pick up a handful of them, because I can't answer them all in the time we've got available. Obviously, as we move forward in developing what this might look like, one of the key things we need to make sure that we are clear on is the various roles of those charged with governance, management, and external auditors. and that we are clear and don't mislead people in any way in that area. We also need to look at any impact this could have on relationships between the two, and anything that it might do to extend the expectation gap between the various parties. So I hear loud and clear that particular issue, and it is also top of mind for us. I heard once again that reinforcement that we need to be clear that this isn't everything, it is material misstatement. So we are certainly going to have to emphasise that both in our wording and our examples. In terms of the options, I appreciate the different views you have. Whenever I have this conversation, people have different views, and the reality is somewhere the board is going to have to come down with a preferred option. I do hear the preference for option 4 from a number of people. I also hear some concerns around option 3 in terms of concluding, and obviously option 5 has its challenges. We did look at some specific fraud risks because both the UK and the Netherlands now have reporting in this area. So we have pulled out a number of annual reports and looked at those fraud risks. They are wide and varied. They range from one paragraph up to a couple of pages of detailed fraud risks. So we have looked at those. I thought it was a good point in terms of making sure that we don't inadvertently in the drafting or in the standard, in the drafting of the standard, imply that these internal controls on fraud also cover all internal controls in terms of the financial statements. So I thought that was a very useful point, and thank you for that input around definition and abuse. Jim, I'm sure we'll pick up the essence of that as we move forward. So with that, undoubtedly in March next year, you'll have this conversation again, because this will have been worked up in terms of some examples and specific requirements based on both your input and what the board says next week. So I appreciate the help you've given us at this point in time, but don't by any means think that this is set in stone. This is the task force's view at this point in time, and we will certainly change and amend that as we hear from the board and get other input. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you. And that's all I have. Do you want to continue on with?
Yes, thank you. The final area we wanted to talk about was the introduction, which we are looking to change reasonably significantly based on what we have heard from stakeholders. The first is that we change the emphasis of the audit to the auditor's responsibilities. Currently, it talks about what we don't do before it talks about what we do as auditors. And so describing the auditor's responsibilities in a positive manner rather than as a disclaimer is the first change we are anticipating making. The second change is to look at the relationship between 250 and 240 in terms of laws and regulations, and that is still work in progress. Whilst we will, and this could well feed into the discussion we've just had about material fraud compared with non-material fraud, but we want to be clear that non-material fraud is not part of this standard. So it is not every control or every fraud risk. It is only the material stuff. And from this conversation, I take that we need to be clearer about that. The other matters that we are addressing by the task force in this regard are highlighting that the auditor is concerned with both actual and suspected fraud that could cause a material misstatement. And so that would be no change from extent. We're not proposing to change that at this point in time. We are also working to make a clearer link between 240 and 315, as I've already said, explaining the relationship between inherent risks and inherent risk factors and control and fraud risk factors, and also the addressing deficiencies and weaknesses. So those are the main changes that we are proposing to the introductory paragraphs. They will be shorter, they will be more positively focused, and they will cover those issues. So with that, we can move on to the final slide, I think, which is whether you have any reactions to the introductory section that we are proposing.
Lynn, can you move back one slide so everyone, I guess,
Yes,
can focus on that, since that's the focus of the question. And so it would be good to get some input if sort of the change in emphasis in the introduction, as well as the clarification on non-material fraud, if that would be helpful, as well as the other two. Any thoughts from anyone on that? Hello. Let's see. Akihito.
Thank you, James. Lynn, thank you very much for your presentation. Let me comment regarding non-material fraud. I believe that prudent judgment by auditors should be clearly required when auditors assess the materiality of fraud, considering the influence to other areas and qualitative factors such as whether the identified fraud is management fraud. It is the key not to judge the identified fraud is non-material fraud easily, and to clarify this, I think. In relation to this, to plan and perform appropriate audit procedures in accordance with the materiality level of assessed fraud risk, not uniformly, is crucial. I believe this gear up approach should be included in ISA 240, including the introduction part. That's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Akihito. Galen?
Yeah, Lynn, thank you very much for the presentation. I appreciate the effort that's gone into this. So on the non-material fraud, are you locked into a focus on materiality or significance? And the only reason I bring that up is we're just moving so much into the non-financial information and thinking of sustainability. And I'm not trying to widen the scope of what you're dealing with here, but is it really significance, which I've heard in the discussion earlier, or is it materiality? Are we stuck on the materiality approach as we move forward on this? Thank you.
And anyone else have any comments on there? Lynn, I'm also going to weigh on this because we've worked on this in the government sector as well. And you do have the issue in terms of materiality. There are two aspects. There's quantitative and qualitative. And certainly if you're at a large organization, a multi-billion-dollar organization, and 5% of revenues is your materiality as a general rule, that could exclude there's some very large numbers in terms of fraud that could occur that wouldn't reach a level of reporting. So I do think there's something that has to be discussed, at least in terms of qualitative aspects as well, or focused on. And that is all the questions we have on this round. Lynn, do you want to?
Yeah, first of all, I observe it's interesting that all of the comments have been on non-material fraud. So I'm taking from that people are reasonably happy with the emphasis of the auditor's responsibilities. On non-material fraud, and to Jasper and Sally Ann, I apologise, I should have actually read my notes better. It is based on materiality on qualitative and quantitative characteristics, not one or other. And I think we have got in the draft an example, which is fraud by the chief executive, obviously is qualitatively incredibly important, no matter the fact that it doesn't actually reach a financial materiality level. So we are, in terms of the drafting, considering both aspects. And the other comments, helpful, and we'll take into account as we look at that section on non-material fraud. Thank you for that input.
Okay. Well, Lynn, this is the end of your presentation for the fraud aspect. We're running about 10 minutes early, so you win the award for this CAG meeting for earlier completion. I think what we'll go ahead and do is take our break now, because we're due a 10-minute break, and then we'll reconvene at 5:10 Eastern Standard Time, so 10 minutes from now. Why don't we do that?
Jim, I did have a way forward slide, but people can...
No, then by all means, we have time.
Yeah. Can I just run through that? We have next week at the September meeting, we'll be talking about transparency of reporting and a redrafted section based on 315. It's a short session, but we need to get the board's input at this point in time. In November, we will get as close to a near full draft of the standard as we can. I suspect it won't be as near full as we'd like it to be, but we'll get as far as we can. And we are expecting approval in 2023, sometime between the second and third quarter of the exposure draft. So that's where we're at in terms of the project at this point in time.
And so, Lynn, that will give the opportunity for the CAG to provide you with feedback as it goes through the process, if it's a 2023 turn.
Agreed.
Also, I want to go to our PIOB observer. Dave, do you have any comments? Oh, your hand's
Great,
up.
thanks,
Yes.
Jim. Yeah, well, yeah, that was the clue. thank you very much, Lynn. Thanks for that presentation. That was really well done. This fraud project is an important project for the public interest, and so I appreciate you what you've updated us with. Obviously, a lot of work has gone on since we last heard about this. The transparency and reporting is one of those key public interest issues, and I realize that as you gather all of this input, it's not showing you one clear direction, but I know that you're doing a good job of synthesizing this information. And specifically, I'd just like to applaud you and the task force and the staff members for the specific outreach that you did with users of financial statements. It's a difficult group to hear from when it comes to auditing standards. And the specific effort you made in that area, I think will pay dividends as you go through in the drafting of the standard. So I think that this, I think that's really just sort of a real hallmark of what can be done if you put your mind to it and really go after that. So well done there. With respect to the introduction, I think the modifications that you described make sense. I think reinforcing the role of the auditor in detecting fraud, financial reporting fraud, and making sure that's reduced to an acceptable level is critically important. As somebody mentioned earlier, financial statement fraud, it appears to be rare. Certainly, we hear about it in more unusual circumstances. There's a real danger in that, obviously, is that we get comfortable and don't have that heightened awareness for fraud. And it's critical that the standard remind the auditor of their responsibilities with respect to fraud. And I'd just like to say very briefly on internal controls, I think we would all agree that well-designed and effectively implemented internal controls also reduce fraud in addition to fraud controls. And I think some mention of that in the standard that the auditor can take that into account in assessing the risk for fraud would be useful as well. But thanks for that, and thanks, Jim, for the time.
Thank you, Dave. Anyone else have any comments on the way forward or anything else? I do not see any. So we will go on our break. We will return in 10 minutes, which will be 15 after the hour, wherever you are. So I'll see everyone in 10. Thanks. All right, Lynn, I want to welcome everyone back. Please join us back. And the next topic is the topic that has generated an awful lot of conversation from the CAG. So Lynn, if you could update us on your journey so far, that would be great.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jim. And it has been quite a rapid journey. And I know there are a lot of papers in this area and a lot of different topics, and you can anticipate that this will continue because we are putting real emphasis on getting the standard out as soon as possible. Next slide, please. So what we have done to date was we approved putting this topic into the work plan in December 2021. So 9 months ago, we agreed that this was a really important topic and it should go into the work plan. In March, we had presentations, very good presentations by a number of key stakeholders in this area, and the board had breakout groups where we brainstorm what were the challenges and what we basically should do. And in June, we put before the board a proposal to develop an overarching standard on sustainability reporting. Next slide, please. And the outcome of those discussions was that we should start standard setting immediately, and that we needed particularly to be timely in developing this. The second decision was that we would develop an overarching assurance standard on sustainability. And the third decision was that we would develop a project proposal that sets out what we intend to do. So indeed, that's what we've done. Next slide, please. We have developed a project proposal that has two objectives. They are on the screen. I don't intend to read them. The orange words at the bottom, though, are important. What we are proposing is that we develop a new series of standards called IAASB 5000 on sustainability. So those are two of the matters in the proposal. Next slide, please. This is a slide you've already, it has been put before the board twice. I think it was subsequent to the CAG meeting. So the first thing we are talking about for immediate action in the overarching standard is we've agreed to cover limited and reasonable assurance. We've agreed to cover all areas of the engagement, and that means all frameworks, all types of information that is sustainability. And we have also agreed that we will provide more specificity about the priority areas, which I'll come to in a sec. On the future, we may, and it is a may, but it's a probable may, develop and build a suite of standards over time that respond to either an emerging risk, where there's additional challenges, or where reporting and assurance is evolving. And we all know that for those of us who are following this area, that evolving nature is now on a weekly basis, not a monthly or annual. So moving to the next slide, I said we covered all areas. These are all the areas that we are considering as a part of our top our work. We're going to cover all sustainability topics, all information disclosed about those topics, all kinds of reporting, whether it's an entire report or a part of a report, all types of reporting standards, and all users and stakeholders. We've made the decision that it's wider than just investors in financial statements. There are a multitude of users and stakeholders in this area. I've already addressed limited and reasonable assurance. The bottom white box, we made a decision at the June meeting that that the new overarching standard would be standalone from IAASB 3000 revised, but it would be based on it. So not a dramatic change, but important that one would be able to put into the auditor's report that you have complied with ISSA 5000, not ISSA 5000 and 3000 and 3410, etc. Moving right on. The 6 areas where we have decided there's a need for more specificity should actually be very familiar to people. They were part of the sustainability EER guidance, and they continue to be areas of real interest to practitioners. I must have said limited and reasonable assurance half a dozen times so far. It is a priority area for us, as is suitable reporting criteria. The scope of the engagement is an ongoing issue in this area. An area though that is being added in terms of more detail to the overarching standard is evidence. There is and I'll come back to that. Internal controls, there's a section of that in the sustainability EER guidance. So it continues to be an issue, as does practitioners' materiality. You'll note that we have tended to talk about materiality generally before. We have specifically scoped this as being the assurance practitioner's materiality. Because the materiality matrices used by preparers for this kind of information are outside the scope of our mandate. The board did ask us to look at being more specific about reporting. However, we have looked at what's in 3000 and what's in the sustainability EER guidance, and there is already extensive guidance in this area. So we're looking for how we can signpost that better for our stakeholders. Next slide, please. Okay, the approach we're taking to drafting, and this is the major part we're putting in front of the board for this meeting, is first of all that we need to define the terms. So we are using 3000 and 3410 as we plan to. We're putting more emphasis on 3410 than we previously had thought, basically because the bit about audit procedures and audit evidence is largely in 3410, not 3000. So we have taken those 2 standards. We have also looked at the ISAs and the EER guidance, and we have identified those terms, and we will identify the terms, actually we have done it, that we think should be defined for this standard. The next part of the approach is to look at the requirements and application material for 3000 and 3410 and identify what should go into the new standard. If there are gaps or if there are bits that are unclear, in terms of sustainability. From 33,000 and 3410, we will look at the ISAs, and we have developed some criteria which will be in front of the board this meeting to identify which ISAs should be included in this new standard. Next slide, please. The reason I'm going between what we're planning to do and what we're actually doing is these are happening concurrently. So even though this is project proposals being prepared, some of the work is already being put in front of the board. The fourth step we'll go through is to review all of the EER guidance. At this stage, it looks like the EER guidance will probably be very useful for application material. And finally, in the approach, we will address the priority areas. So that's how we plan to run this project. It's the approach we're going to take to drafting. Next slide, please. In terms of timing, it's a lot of words on that slide. Basically, we're heading towards an exposure draft in 2023, which will be a significant exposure draft, getting comments back and trying to complete something by late 2024 when particularly the European standards come into play. Maybe it will go to 2025 as we go through all the approval processes, but we are working very hard to get to that late 2024, early 2025 of a substantially complete standard on sustainability. Next slide, please. So that is a very quick run through the project proposal. We will be putting it to the board for approval. We think it's in a fairly good state and that many of the key decisions have been made at the March and June meeting. This is confirming them or and adding some more detail in terms of the approach we're taking. So the two questions we are very interested in hearing from you about are whether the project proposals support the public interest, and secondly, whether the priority areas where we intend to provide specificity accord with what you know is happening in this area. And of course, any other matters that you want to raise with us. So Jim, that's the project proposal. I've moved on to the rest of the substantive papers once we've finished this.
Okay. Lynn, it seems like you've made tremendous progress since we last spoke on this topic.
And Jim, I should actually thank the staff who've gone above and beyond to get us to this point. So to Claire, Natalie and Adriana, brilliant work, guys, to get us all this way, and many thanks for it.
Well, if I rewind our group to your last presentation, I think I would frame this a little bit also in area, are you going in the right direction? In addition to whether it's supports the public interest.
Yep.
Let's see if we have any comments here. Rarely does this seem to be a subject where we don't have comments. Galen.
Yeah, thanks, Lynn. And I thought I heard you say that focusing on reasonable assurance as opposed to limited assurance was going to be a priority, but I want to hear that again. Is that the case? I think it should be.
It's both. We're going to look at both limited and reasonable assurance. The rationale for that is currently people are giving limited assurance. So that's the reality of a lot of assurance that's been given at this point in time. We also know that the direction of travel is towards reasonable assurance. So we don't want to limit the standard to limited assurance. We think it should do both limited and reasonable. And as one plays off the other, it's going to be important to have both in the standard. So the standard will cover limited and reasonable assurance.
That certainly makes sense to me, but I guess your response is it's transitory. I think everyone would want, and I think you pointed that out, end up on reasonable assurance in the end, and that's a lot of thought needs to go into that. Sure, thank you.
Great.
Thanks, Keelan. Hilda?
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation, Lynn. I think good progress. So we are very supportive of this project and of where you have gotten at this point in time. And good luck to meet the challenging and ambitious timeline. I'm very happy to support anywhere where we can. On the objectives, that seems to do what it needs to do. On the priority areas, it's more of a question because some of it might be underneath the ones that you have named. When we talk to assurance providers, we understand that the areas that they most struggle with are related to, the subject matter, which is much more narrative and also much more forward-looking. And so if you talk with them, you get the impression that dealing with that and responding to those concerns would be a priority area. So a question, is that something you will look at as well? And then a next one, it's basically a combination of two matters. It's related to the preconditions to actually be able to provide assurance. And if those are not met, the impact that has on the auditor's reporting. There is an expectation, and in practice, it is already like that the reporting on sustainability reporting, so the audit reporting on sustainability reporting will, because the reporting by companies will be much less robust, will lead to many more qualifications or disclaimers or whatever it is than we are used to with financial statements. Partly this will be related to the preconditions of assurance not being met, and then many other factors. And there are a lot of questions around this and how dealing with this, and that's something that we here would need specific attention as well. So thank you for indicating whether that's part of the project or whether that's not in this phase, the attention. We would have some comments on limited and reasonable assurance as well, but maybe that's for the next session on other matters. Thank you.
Thank you, Hilda. Akihiro.
Thank you, James. Lynn, thank you very much for your clear presentation. First of all, I overall support the status and future plan of this very important project. That is adopting agile approach, focusing on priority areas. I expect to continue to engage and collaborate with wider stakeholders with keeping in mind the balance between timeliness and process. And I'd like to mention two overall points. The first point is outreach activities. It is very good to plan ongoing outreach activities to ensure that outreach activities are effective and efficient in a limited time. I think that the coordination with other standard setters, regulators, and focusing on the priority areas, significant issues, and carrying out at the right timing are important. Additionally, in the area of sustainability assurance, non-professional accountants also provide sustainability assurance. I understand that non-professional accountants sometimes refer not ISAE 3000 but other assurance standards. So to conduct outreach also with non-professional accountants, sustainability providers, and other assurance standard setters such as ISO and AA at an early stage is crucial. I expect the inclusive development of sustainability assurance standard. The second point is the diversity of the working group and also reference groups, especially in the sustainability area, taking into account the various situations regarding reporting and assurance from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. It is crucial to have diverse members in terms of market development and geography. That's my comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Lynn, since there were several different points in the last couple comments, do you want me to stop there? Do you want me to continue? I have about 6 or 7 hands still up.
I'll address those points. Thank you for them. In terms of narrative and forward-looking, it will be inherent in the standard that we deal with those. We haven't picked them as priority areas. There's a lot of work in the EER guidance that should help people in that regard, but it's impossible to write a standard on on sustainability without dealing with narrative and forward-looking. So we'd expect it to be a part of that. In terms of the second part of the question, preconditions and scope go together hand in hand. So it is certainly a priority area we're dealing with. Thank you for the comments around outreach. One of our challenges with outreach is to balance how much we can, the drafting and the work with outreach, because there's a limited time that we can, well, a limited resource. So we are doing a lot of outreach, and I accept that we need to do it. It's just balancing it with the drafting. In terms of other professionals, we are writing a standard that is intended to deal with other, be available to other professions. So one of the things we have done is set up a reference group of other professionals to actually provide us with advice and help of what would be useful for them. And certainly that reference group goes across different countries and different professions. In terms of diversity of the working group or task force itself, we will have a, the task force allocations are something that are being worked through by the staff and chair at present, but I'm sure they'll take note of the importance of diversity across that group.
Okay. Thank you.
I think that was it. Jim, did I miss any?
No, I think you've covered it. Tyson?
Yes, thank you, Jim. Thank you, Jim, for the very clear presentation and for the update and for the work that has been done so far towards developing a new standards for assurance on sustainability reporting. This is very good because it's, in our opinion, is serving to the public interest and supporting the public interest. So we are supporting the way it is realized until now and on the way forward, because the objectives decided has been very clear, and we see this as a very important one when the other sustainability reporting is on the way to be further developed. Of course, it will be drafted as a standalone, but based on IAASB 3000 and also the other, for example, ISAS and EAR materials. And according to us, the objectives and the priorities are very clear, and the approach to be followed also is okay. I see the timeline quite intensive, and with these timelines, moving forward quickly will help to have quality standards for this kind of report. Thank you.
So Heisen, that's overall support is what I'm hearing?
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. Let's see who's next in my queue. Valerie.
Yes, thank you, Jim. Thank you, Lynn, for this very clear presentation. Just to express strong support for this relevant and useful project that works in the public interest. Sustainability reporting has quickly become a topic of global importance, and its reliability is a key issue for many stakeholders, and this includes banks, which need reliable information from their customers in order to make informed lending and investment decisions, but also to be able to measure and manage their own climate-related financial risks. So I would like to make just a few comments. First, we agree it should cover limited and reasonable assurance. And we think that an important aspect of this is reporting. Audit reporting needs to be covered as a significant element for users to have confidence. So they need to understand the work that has been done and what the opinion means. So we can imagine that at least in the yearly years, there might be mixes of limited assurance and reasonable assurance, as well as various modifications, for example, scope limitation. And so we believe that a clear audit report will be key to help users understand the confidence they can place in the reported information. We have a second comments. We support that this standard would be suitable across all reporting frameworks, but with respect to acceptability of the frameworks, we believe there is a risk of undermining confidence if auditors rush to give assurance where, for example, sustainability standards do not really support reasonable assurance because their requirements are not well specified as a basis against which the auditor can audit. So we think that the assurance standard will need to give some attention to how the auditor assesses the suitability of the framework as a precursor to accepting an engagement, and in that regard, encourage IAASB to continue to work closely with IAASB so that the latter can develop auditable sustainability standard and the former can develop robust assurance standard. Then after we have comments on materiality, because materiality is a key concept in the preparation of sustainability related financial information, because it drives management decision about what information to present and disclose. But in our view, the standard gives a broad definition of fair value, which is taking into account to estimate materiality. And this which may be a source of uncertainty for auditors. And in addition, materiality is equally critical in performing an assurance engagement. So if there is a single materiality in the assurance standard, guidance will be needed due to having to consider the value chain. And lastly, I would say that at this yearly stage, we do not see IAASB paying particular attention to the risk of greenwashing, and we would like to draw its attention to the need to address this risk, because greenwashing calls for particular attention and should be addressed. It is our understanding that IAASB draft revision of the standard on fraud in an audit of financial statement does not address this specific issue. We believe that this risk is not very different from other sources of potential bias in auditing standard. So we could imagine that it can be dealt with in guidance, in risk assessment and work effort. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Valerie. Lynn, I have about 3 more here that have hands up. Do you want me to continue on, or?
I'm happy for you to continue, Jim. I'll take them all together.
Okay, thanks. Kazuhiro.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Lynn, for to the point presentation. I strongly agree with working on the development of ISSA 5000. Investor demand for quality assurance of sustainability information is increasing, and the development of standard is in the public interest. I also agree with covering all sustainability topics, all reporting mechanisms, and all reporting standards in order to accommodate diverse sustainability information frameworks. I believe that investors will be the main users of assurance information, but I don't object to targeting a wide range of stakeholders. Considering that the EU standards are also covered and that double materiality is being addressed, I agree with the inclusion of practitioners other than accountants as well. The assurance should cover not only whether the content of individual sustainability information is properly reported, but also whether the reporting is done appropriately in accordance with the framework established by the standards. For example, if reporting standards and frameworks require the disclosure of material information that will lead to the increasing of medium to long-term corporate value, it is also subject to assurance that the company's materiality judgments are consistent. Specifically, it should be ensured that not only favorable but also unfavorable information are disclosed among information with similar materiality. And ISSA 5000 covers both limited assurance and reasonable assurance, but as realistic response, a first priority should be given to the development of criteria for limited assurance. And also all reporting standards are covered, but the IAASB standards should be given priority, considering the wide scope of application, the timing of development, and the high level of investors' needs. Thank you.
Thank you, Kazuhiro. Sandra.
Hello. My comment was spurred by something that Hildy said with respect to forward-looking information and the qualitative nature of the information. And I think Valerie did an excellent job of summarizing some of the things that we have identified in responding to the, the IAASB's IF draft S1 and draft S2 both ask questions with respect to whether the information was verifiable and enforceable. And we included in our response to that, CFA Institute's response to that, a listing in S1 of challenges we saw related to verifiability, many of which were things that Valerie articulated, including the definition of materiality and using enterprise value and the difference in definition of materiality within and outside the financial statements. So I would encourage, Lynn, for you to take a look at those, because it's in the appendix, not in the actual letter. You have to click through to find it. It was getting too long. But I thought it was kind of took a great deal of time to go through it, but now in hearing Valerie's comment, I think it was really quite useful. And I think that there's a good list of things that are included there. One of which is even location, because of S1 says the information can be located and cross-referenced in multiple locations. I think it's going to be very hard for investors to understand what makes the complete set of sustainability standards, how the statement of compliance matches that, and whether the audit report goes right next to it. So I think that this standard needs to be married up with some of the progress and the more detailed thinking that certainly I, as representing users, have done on this issue. Because I think the devil is in the detail. And while, for example, the IAASB can't control these things because they aren't in charge of verification per se, like in the US and the SEC's questions on this topic, these are very important considerations for investors. And I would just encourage you to have a look at that.
Thank you, Sandra. Henry.
Thank you very much, Jim. Thank you very much, Lynn, for the comprehensive presentation and materials for the meeting. Really good to hear the progress that's been made on this really important area since the meeting in March. There's clearly a lot of work been going on. I think I said in March that the work the IAASB is doing in this space is very important to my organization, the IFRS Foundation's new IAASB. And it's a key part of getting sustainability disclosure reporting on a par with the financial reporting. So very much pleased to see this project proposal. And in the paper, you've highlighted the dialogue and engagement that's already going on between the IAASB and the IAASB. And of course, actually just this week, there's been some very good dialogue. I know the IAASB also appreciated the comment letter that you sent in on the initial exposure draft. So that dialogue is valued very much on our side. Maybe just a quick update for members around the table. But the IAASB now is fully operating. It's been meeting as a board since July. And actually at this month's meeting in Frankfurt, the board will be considering the feedback on the two initial exposure drafts that were published in March. And the board is aiming to keep up the momentum and pace that's you're trying to operate at today. So very much aiming to resolve and consider and discuss in public the major key issues that have been raised by stakeholders on those exposure drafts by the end of this year. I think just at this stage, I just got one comment was just to make, and it was really about the timelines. And one can see in the papers and the proposal very much how you've already taken steps to move at pace in the way that you're designing the project. And really, it was just to say I'd encourage you to continue to look for ways that you can continue to maintain that momentum and pace, but clearly respecting your due process. I mean, I don't know whether there's things about additional meetings and leveraging off the consultative groups and intellectual property, but anything that can be done to keep the pace going, I think is important for this project. So I think I'll hold my question for later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry. Well, Lynn, as expected, we did have a lot of comments, and given the topic, I certainly understand why. So I'll turn it over to you.
Excellent. Thank you very much to everybody that spoke, and thank you, Jim. What I heard was support for what we're doing, which I appreciate. I hear you on limited and reasonable assurance and materiality, and I'm not going to address the specific issues because that's work in progress. But that was useful input into our consideration. I think Henry said everything I was going to say about the IAASB. Certainly our submission concentrates on verifiability because that's our particular interest. And we have regular and ongoing dialogue with the board and with the staff, and that should continue. Whilst we are going to be framework neutral, obviously the IAASB 1 and 2 are developing as significant standards. So we have to put a real focus on those two, and we will do. In terms of greenwashing, the IAASB staff put out some staff guidance on greenwashing recently, and we think that's adequately covering the field at this point in time. So I just draw your attention to the IAASB greenwashing's guidance that is in public arena now. And believe us, in terms of timelines, we are going to try and keep the pace up without overburdening our staff, of course. But we do see that one of the real public interest matters we have to address in terms of this standard is timeliness. And we have specifically, and it's the first time in my time on the board, we have actually said one of the preeminent public interest issue here is time. And so we will continue to move at pace, and we're thinking of every innovative way that we can possibly continue at that pace. What that means, though, for CAG and the board is there's likely to be lots and lots of reading going through the board meetings coming up in this area. So with that, and I know I haven't answered many of the specific questions, and that is for the reason that this is a proposal at present rather than a worked up answers, but we will hear you take those into account. So do you want me to move on, Jim?
Yes, please do.
Next slide, please. Okay, we're now moving from what we propose to do to what we're actually doing. And the first thing was to make sure we had one set of terms that we all agree on. So we have in fact drafted a paper that identifies what we think should be the defined terms, and that is being put in front of the board. The one that we are adding is assertions. The one we are debating is between engagement partner and engagement leader, and the proposals that I think are perfectly sensible are sustainability information and underlying sustainability information. I'm not sure, I can't quite remember the final one, but those terms are set out for discussion next week. Secondly, we have already started identifying the requirements. The process we started with was 3,000. As I've already said, we found that there's a part in 3,000 that's better covered in 3410. So we have used that to develop the requirements. We haven't yet started on application material or 3400, but we do have actually a lot more than we've put in front of the board at present in terms of the requirements out of those two standards. Where there is a gap or whether there is more specificity in or more recent standards, we are considering the ICEs to fill those gaps. And what I've just described are the criteria that we are applying to that. One of the critical issues in this is to work out how much detail we go to in terms of those ICEs, and the papers we've put in front of the board give a variety of, from some standards, a little we put into other standards where, like 220 in terms of quality management, where we've got quite a lot, and we're looking for the board to help us determine what is the appropriate balance between the two. We are also providing the board with, on the basis of the criteria, which ICEs we will consider further and which ones we will not be considering further at this point in time, and we'll be looking for their guidance. We will also review the EER guidance, and I've already said it's most likely to be application material, and we have started that work. Other than identifying the priority areas and highlighting them on the structure, we haven't done anything else at this point in time. Next slide, please. Okay, we have worked on a structure and we are basing it on the ISA for LCEs. And on the slide in front of you are the 9 parts of that structure. This is work in progress at present, and we know it will change, move and morph over the extent of the project. But what we're looking for from people at this point in time, does this look like a sensible starting point for us in terms of structure? Next slide, please. I think I've already talked about the definitions, but I'll just quickly run through them again. Assertions is the new one we're adding. Engagement partner, split views on whether we are being inclusive enough with engagement partner, and should we go to engagement leader. Next slide, please. This will reveal where I'm thinking. Sustainability information replacing subject matter information, and the one I keep forgetting which one it's replacing, which is sustainability subject matter replacing underlying subject matter. So they have been taken from 3,000 and tailored to some extent. Next slide, please. And I think we can skip that. I've already talked about it. Next slide, please. So what we are interested in from you is 2 questions. Firstly, whether the structure is a good starting point for us, or whether you have different views. And of the other matters that I have talked through in terms of definitions, criteria, etc., is there anything else you'd like to share at this point in time? Jim, back to you.
Thank you, Lynn. And we already have a hand up, I believe, Paul.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Lynn. Well, what a morning you must be having. What with this and fraud, quite something for you down there in New Zealand. It's clear that personally you must have your plate more than full, and this is a huge project. The fraud is obviously very important too. But for the whole time that I've been following the work of the IAASB, I feel this is possibly the most important in a very long time, possibly as long as ago as Clarity, if not before. And of course, it will be no less demanding. So all I can really do at this point is offer you our fulsome support and congratulations on such terrific progress thus far. We at IFA, we like the fact you're fast tracking this project. We like the general direction of travel. We like the fact that you're adopting a flow in the proposed standard that is similar to that of the ISA for LCE. But that being said, we do wonder, however, how SMEs and less complex entities are being or will be factored into this project, because we believe that is pretty critical right from the get-go, right from the outset, that they be carefully considered. We trust that you will be embracing the CUSP drafting principles right from the start, and I think a simple, scalable standard that embraces the CUSP principles is going to be the interest of everybody. Talking about sort of developments in the European Union, which is the domicile of most member organizations of IFA, it looks likely that in the foreseeable future, many SMEs, hundreds of thousands of SMEs possibly, may end up having to report in order to fulfill value chain reporting obligations. And we suspect many others that don't have to report will voluntarily choose to report. So really, I guess from where we're sitting, we would hope that the standard is going to be fit for purpose, fit for SMEs. And that might require, for example, having a core set of requirements that are applicable to all entities, and then maybe additional requirements that you would layer on for listed, for PIs, for banks, insurance companies, or whatever. Or perhaps it's a time for an IFA for LCE. I don't know. I guess the important thing is that we just need some comfort that SMEs aren't going to be forgotten. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. And speaking of Paul.
Thank you very much. And Paul Thompson actually, had a couple of my comments. So this is a very ambitious project, but very appropriate. And applaud what you're doing. I think the direction is right. I like the structure. The only question I had, and I wouldn't necessarily expect to see it in the structure, but since I am here representing the internal audit profession, is what you might expect in terms of the use of others, including internal auditors. Is that something that might be covered within the standard, or is that something where you would just default to ISO 610 as is often the case? Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Akihito.
Thank you, James. Lynn, thank you very much for your explanation. I think great considering process. I have one brief comment in relation to question 3. As Valerie mentioned earlier, I think that taking into account the importance of greenwashing for wider stakeholders, ISA 240 should also be considered. ISA 240 is currently under revision, but it may be important to consider incorporating, even partially, the concepts and provisions of current ISA 240. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Akihito. Hilda.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Lynn. Comment on the structure, or at least related to it. You were very clear in pointing out that the standard will deal both with limited assurance and reasonable assurance, and I think people commented on there is a natural progression, which I think is definitely what we see as well. There were some comments that alluded to seeing a mixture of limited and reasonable assurance in one and the same engagement. We see that less, and we see that often where there is no assurance initially given on sustainability reporting, it then moves to limited assurance, and eventually the end goal is reasonable assurance. And so from that point of view, having a standard which deals together in one standard, both with limited assurance and reasonable assurance, is something that within our community at least is questioned as the most practical way to deal with the assurance. And so we hear a request for what I would call a building block approach, or at least a clear signposting within the standard, whether specific parts of it or requirements, application material, wherever you are in the standard, that's related to limited assurance, related to reasonable assurance, or applicable for both. And if that could be clear, it might just be about feasible to have it in one standard. But without that, it's considered to potentially be quite confusing and not as practical as it could be. Thank you.
Thank you, Hilda. Kazuhiro.
Thank you. I have the opinion regarding question 3. Regarding the document H6, I have 2 comments. First of all, ISA 540 is marked as no further consideration in document H6. Does this mean that it is not included in new standard? The IAASB standard also includes climate change related scenario analysis as a disclosure target. And sustainability information includes a lot of information that needs to be estimated, and future-oriented information. Nonetheless, I feel strange that the ISA 540 is not considered. And next, in ISA 3000, etc., there are regulations regarding the reading of other information similar to ISA 720. And the expression other information appears in document H5. Nonetheless, I find it strange that the H6 states that ISA 720 is no further consideration. If the assurance undertook on all type of sustainability information, the cost of preparers can be enormous, and preparers may not be able to afford the financial burden of disclosure. And practitioners who provide assurance may also run out of human resources. And some information is technically difficult to assure, such as information that also covers the supply chain. Therefore, in the early stage, assuring only information with high materiality and dealing with other disclosure information by the provision of ISA 720 regarding the reading of other information is considered as a realistic way to assure sustainability reporting. Thank you.
Thank you, Kazuhiro. Anyone else? There's a few folks on the CAG I have not heard from the last couple of days, so it would be great if I could hear all opinions or all views. So if anyone else that hasn't had a chance to comment would do so, that would be helpful.
Jim, while people are thinking what they might want to say, can I make one correction to what I said? The greenwashing paper is actually going to IAASB board next week and won't be out till October. So it's not in public arena yet. It will be in the near future. Sorry about that.
And thank you, Lynn. And I'll actually add my comment as well. And that's, I think, maybe in two areas. One is in the use of specialist. Now, I know that auditors all the time audit financial statements, and sometimes a good portion of that work goes out to specialists. But in this case, it could almost be 100% specialist. Is there any special considerations that you would have to incorporate in thinking that through? So that's, I'd like to add that question. And we do have a couple more folks. Tara?
Hey, Jim. So yeah, I agree with everything everybody's been saying. And I guess the only thing that I would add is I guess in terms of the risk assessment, maybe, because there's going to be so much reliance on report, like, you know, because I invest in these 3 companies and I have a business dealing with these 3 companies, I'm very reliant on their reporting. And so this interconnectedness to the nth degree is going to make the risk assessment, I think, you know, unlike anything we've ever seen. And just again, I don't have answers, I only have questions, right? How are we going to bake that in to our auditing process? That, to me, that's the biggest question I have. Reliance on other reports, that kind of thing. But otherwise, I'm all for this, hugely necessary.
It's quite an effort. Thank you. Greg?
Sorry, thank you. I'm not sure if it's an observation or a comment with respect to structure or public interest, but the one reflection I have that hasn't been raised is the decision to structure the work as a single reference document. You know, I did read with interest the rationale for that, and the arguments, some of them are persuasive, but I'm still struck by the fact that it's another example of a 200-page document for comment that could be a barrier to obtaining feedback during due process. So I would encourage the task force to keep thinking about how can we approach due process in such a way that where the work is simply leveraging or applying a principle that already exists, that they don't draw attention or too much attention to it during due process, such that it distracts from the new guidance or the new requirements that are being put forward to support the profession and the nature of this work. So I don't know what the right answer is, similar to, I guess, Tara's comment, but I don't think the continued publication of complete standards that go from planning to reporting is the right answer. We seem to keep doing that. And as a result, we're repeating ourselves in the standards and potentially contradicting some of it, you know, as the comment was raised about the use of internal audit, for example. So I still think there's some thinking that could be done in that area. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. All right, I don't see any other hands up at the moment. Lynn, I'll give it back to you.
Okay. I've heard general acceptance with the exception of the last comment in terms of the structure. So that's helpful. Certainly CUSP and LCEs or SMEs are absolutely top of mind, and this has to apply to all entities. So whether we integrate them or have separate sections is yet to be decided, but certainly on cusp, it's decided we will go plain English and use those principles. In terms of internal audit, and this goes to one of the challenges of this, of producing this standard, we don't intend to go into 610 any further. We will make have a requirement around internal audit, but we don't think we need to go into detail at this point in time. So 610 will stay, and we will have a requirement in 5000. You're absolutely right that we'll have to signpost this very carefully to be able to have limited and reasonable assurance. The approach we took in the guidance where we wanted to, the EER guidance, where we wanted to flag both professional judgment and professional skepticism, was by having icons on them. One of the standards actually uses L's and R's to differentiate between limited and reasonable, and that general approach is what we're thinking of in terms of limited and reasonable assurance. In terms of 540 and 720, let us as a working group consider those comments carefully and give you a more reflective opinion than just me talking off the top of my head. In terms of specialists, capability to do these kinds of engagements is absolutely vital. And whilst we will address specialists, we actually, I think, Jim, it's the wider issue of what capability do you need? And the guidance certainly covers the spectrum of it. And I would anticipate that being in the standard as well. Risk assessment 315, and making sure that you get integrated risk assessment through the standard. I don't underestimate how hard it's going to be, but I also think it's an important aspect of these changes. And finally, yes, the size of the document is always an issue, and really I see one of the key challenges is, as we pull things from other standards, is that we keep it at an overarching level, not a detailed level. There is always, in all the consultations on EDs, people very rarely say reduce anything. People want more. And so how we keep it at that high level without drowning in detail is something that the working group and the board going forward need to take into account. The comment, though, about due process, I like the thought of potentially flagging for people what is just a direct take from another standard, so people know, and we are keeping really close eye on referencing where we get stuff from, and getting the comments back on new stuff is actually a good idea. So we'll take that forward to think about it further. I think those were the comments that I heard, Jim. I've got one more slide to go after this, after these questions.
Okay.
Shall I go through it?
Yes, please.
Okay. We, as I've already said, at the September meeting, are going to put the draft project proposal in front of the board with a possible approval turnaround by Friday. We're also going to discuss the structure we've talked about this morning, the definitions and the approach to drafting the requirements, not the actual requirements, although we've given some examples of those parts 1 to 3. In December, I hope we don't have to do the first dot point. I hope that the project proposal is out of the way so we can concentrate on drafting the requirements and application material. And it's our intention to put the 6 priority areas in front of the board at the December meeting. I have to make a proviso on that. It won't be the whole of limited and reasonable assurance. Potentially that will take longer to go through the processes and be more comprehensive, but the other 5 certainly we will try and get those done, and we'll get as far as we can on limited and reasonable. And I have already talked around the timeframes for 23 to 24, so that's it. So in summary, we are continuing at pace, and we will be both in terms of drafting and in terms of our outreach on this project. And before I conclude, can I thank CAG very much for the input you've provided. I've been to CAG many times in the last 6 years, and you've always provided good insights and good input into the projects that I have been leading. So I complete my term in December. So this will be the last time I address CAG. So I just wanted to end by thanking you very much for all that you have contributed. And will continue to.
Thank you, Lynn. And I still have 2 other comments. I want to go to Dave, and also I think Tom, the chair, wants to speak to us. So Tom?
This would be quite quick, but first of all, Lynn alluded to it, and the group here alluded to it. We have got an enormous amount accomplished in a very short period of time. I don't think that pace is going to slow down, and we should mention that we have 3 very talented staff members full-time dedicated to this project, which is a really significant chunk of resources for us. So that gives you some sense of our sense of dedication. And Lynn, in addition to doing fraud, is doing this, and her team of board members of the consultation group are spending an enormous amount of time. We have significant engagement with the IAASB. We were actually on a call yesterday, or I guess it was Tuesday, for a couple hours with the IAASB, and we expect that type of engagement to continue. Someone made this point about other group bodies like GRI and AA1000 and ISO. Our intent is to engage fully on this. But I do want to tell people, though, this is a constrained optimization exercise. We need to get as much as we can get done in a timely fashion. And so the deadlines do matter. So we may act at times that we're not listening for all these nice to haves in this overarching standard, but we're going to have to be disciplined on 2 fronts. We can only deal with so many priorities at once. And secondly, we're going to be disciplined on drawing on what we already have. This was a discussion point we had in June at the board. We can't afford too much greenfielding if timeliness is a requirement. So the great food for thought today. I really appreciate the discussion. It sort of gives us a little bit of a warm-up, Lynn, I would say, for next week's discussion, because I'm sure most of the board members will raise that. So thank you on that. I just wanted to give that perspective as well. Again, I said this in strategy yesterday. Timeliness is a public interest issue, and that therefore imposes some constraints on us.
Thank you, Tom. Dave, do you have any comments relative to sustainability?
I will be brief, Jim, but not because this isn't an important project. It's incredibly important. Lynn, you've done a great job in presenting to us today, and I appreciate that. I appreciate your service on the IAASB. I'm not sure it's in the public interest to let your term expire, but I realize that that will happen regardless of that. You've made great progress on this. Tom, you raised the only point I was going to raise, which is that obviously this requires a significant allocation of resources on the part of the staff, which will be a constraining item. But clearly we look forward to seeing the progress in this area, and thank you for everything you've done so far.
Thank you, Dave. And
that's it.
And Lynn, I just want to thank you for once again presenting to the CAG, I guess for the whole session here on day 2, but also just your willingness to come communicate with us throughout your term on the board. And so we really appreciate all you have done.
Thank you.
And now I think we are going to have some closing remarks. And Tom, I know you were just here, but for the overall CAG meeting, do you have any closing remarks?
No, just again, continued appreciation for the comments. You know, I do a whole pre-brief for our board meetings every time with the staff going into sessions, but I find this is like a double dose of really good input, because a lot of what you raise here is stuff that we will talk about at the board next week, and it gives the perspective and understanding where the stakeholders are coming at. If nothing else, we're giving you a sense that we are busy right now, and we are committed to fulfilling the public interest. And if we do that and then execute on it, we're doing our job. So we still have to execute, but we really appreciate your input. I hope you get a sense that we're trying to do things a little bit innovatively, particularly on some of the investor outreach. Again, this goes to the point of meeting people where they want to be met and making it easier for people to interact with us as a board. I'm conscious of Greg's point about making it easy for people to respond to our comment exposure period. So thank you. Wish everyone well, and I feel free to reach out to me or anyone else at our board in between sessions.
And Tom, I just, for the new members of the CAG, since we do have a few, I just want to point out that next week when the IAASB meets, I am always impressed by all the comments that we make, that the task forces pick them up and discuss them as part of the overall IAASB discussion, as well as the fact I'm there to bring up any that I thought were particularly relevant as well. So thank you.
The other thing is a lot of our board members are listening to this as we speak too, and it really enters their thinking. I've got a number of comments throughout our meetings.
Yes, thank you, Tom. Dave, any final comments from the PIOB perspective for the meeting overall? We covered a lot of ground in the last 2 days.
Jim, I just want to say I really appreciate the active involvement of all the CAG members. I know this is a big time commitment for everybody, not just to be here, but to participate, to prepare, and then to participate fully. And I think it's just a really valuable part of the whole process. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dave. And continuing on the thank yous, I always want to say, show my appreciation for the staff who set this up, all the people that work behind the scenes to get one of these meetings, whether it's live or in person. It is a challenge. So thank you for all the IAASB staff for all that they do. And thank you for all the task force members and all the presenters. And of course, thank you to all the CAG members for your input. I know that the IAASB takes it very seriously. And we are going to have a closing session. Before I do, I just want to highlight we have our 2 upcoming CAG meetings. One is on March the 7th and 8th, and that's, I can't believe I'm saying 2023. That just seems, well, that just seems tough. And so March 7th and 8th, 2023, and there is going to be one on September 12th and 13th, 2023 as well. So with that, I'd like to thank the public observers for listening, and we're going to go into our closed session. Michelle?